They were told Americans would torture them, starve them, and strip them of dignity. But when Japanese prisoners stepped into Camp McCoy in 1944, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They expected the end, not survival. The train had been moving for 3 days through American landscape. The prisoners could barely see through the narrow gaps in the cattle car walls. They sat pressed together, knees drawn up, uniforms torn and stained with salt from the Pacific crossing. Some had bandages wrapped around wounds that hadn't properly healed. Others sat with vacant eyes, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts of home, or perhaps trying not to think at all. Private Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his forehead against the cold wooden slat, watching the blur of snow-covered fields pass outside. He was 23 years old, though he felt ancient. 3 months ago, he had been fighting on Saipan, watching his unit dissolve under American artillery and flamethrowers. He had hidden in a cave for 2 weeks, gnawing on roots and drinking rainwater collected in his helmet, before thirst and hunger drove him to surrender. The shame of that moment still burned in his chest, like a coal that wouldn't cool. Next to him sat Corporal Hideaki Sato, older at 37, a fisherman's son from Hokkaido, who had been drafted in 1941. Sato had survived Guadalcanal, the grinding horror of that jungle campaign, where more men died from disease and starvation than from bullets. He had seen entire companies reduced to skeletons shuffling through mud, eating grass and bark, praying for death. When American forces finally overwhelmed his position near the Tenaru River, Sato had been too weak to lift his rifle. He surrendered with his hands in the air and tears running down his cheeks, expecting to be shot where he stood. The train lurched and groaned as it slowed. Through the gaps, the prisoners glimpsed a town. Snow lay thick on rooftops. Smoke rose from chimneys. People walked on cleared streets, bundled in coats, going about their lives as though war existed only in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The contrast was staggering. These Americans lived in abundance while half the world burned. "Prepare yourselves," whispered Lieutenant Kenji Ishida from the far corner of the car. He was the highest-ranking officer among them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses held together with string. "Whatever comes next, we face it as soldiers of the Emperor. We do not beg. We do not grovel. We accept our fate with dignity." Some of the men nodded. Others said nothing. What dignity remained for men who had surrendered? They had been taught since childhood that capture was the ultimate shame, worse than death. The Imperial Army's Field Service Code was explicit. Do not suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Yet here they were, dozens of disgraced men packed into a train car, heading toward an unknown fate in the heart of enemy territory. The train shuddered to a stop. For a long moment, nothing happened. The prisoners sat in the dim light filtering through the slats, listening to the hiss of steam and the crunch of boots on snow outside. Then the door rattled and swung open with a metallic screech. Cold air rushed in, sharp and bitter, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The prisoners blinked against the sudden brightness. Outside stood American soldiers in heavy coats, rifles slung over their shoulders, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air. Behind them stretched rows of wooden barracks, guard towers with searchlights, and coils of barbed wire glinting in the pale winter sun. "Out! Move it!" barked a sergeant, gesturing sharply. The prisoners understood the tone, if not the words. They climbed down stiffly, their joints protesting after days of confinement. Yamamoto's legs nearly buckled when his feet hit the snow-packed ground. He steadied himself against the train car, feeling the cold seep through his thin canvas shoes. Around him, other prisoners stumbled, blinked, looked around with expressions caught between fear and exhaustion. They formed a ragged line as guards shouted commands. Yamamoto studied the Americans' faces, searching for the cruelty he had been warned about. The propaganda films he had seen before deployment showed Americans as monsters, devils with barbaric grins who delighted in torture. But the faces before him looked ordinary. Young men, many not much older than himself. Some looked bored, others looked tired. One guard was chewing something slowly, his jaw working in a steady rhythm. Then Yamamoto noticed something that made his breath catch. At the edge of the platform stood men in civilian clothes with red crosses on white armbands. Red Cross officials. He had heard of them in training, neutral observers who supposedly monitored prisoner treatment according to international law. But his instructors had dismissed such things as Western propaganda. The Americans will ignore these rules the moment it suits them, they had said. Do not believe their lies about humane treatment. Yet here, the Red Cross representatives stood, clipboards in hand, watching carefully as the prisoners were assembled. An interpreter stepped forward, a Japanese-American man in a U.S. Army uniform. Several prisoners stiffened at the sight of him, their faces darkening with contempt. A traitor, a dog of the Americans. But the interpreter's expression remained neutral as he spoke in clear Japanese. You are now prisoners of war held by the United States Army at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, housed, and provided medical care. You will work, but you will be paid for your labor. You will not be tortured or abused. If you follow orders and camp rules, you will be safe here until the war ends and repatriation is arranged. The words hung in the frozen air. Several prisoners exchanged glances. It sounded too good to be true. It had to be a trick. Corporal Sato leaned close to Yamamoto and whispered, "They say these things to make us soft, to make us betray information. Do not believe them." But even as Sato spoke, Yamamoto noticed the guard chewing that strange substance blow a pink bubble from his mouth, then pop it and resume chewing. The casual nature of it, the complete lack of menace, unsettled him more than threats would have. They were marched across the compound toward a long, low building. As they walked, Yamamoto took in the details of the camp. The barracks were solid wood construction, not the flimsy structures he had lived in on Pacific Islands. Smoke rose from stovepipes, suggesting heat inside. The paths between buildings were cleared of snow and lined with gravel. Everything was organized, orderly, maintained. Through the window of one barracks, he glimpsed American soldiers sitting at tables, playing cards, laughing. The scene looked so normal, so peacetime, that it created a strange dissonance in his mind. How could they be so relaxed? Did they not know that war was raging across the world? The intake building was warm, blissfully, almost painfully warm after the bitter cold outside. The prisoners filed into a large room with benches along the walls and several processing stations set up with desks and medical equipment. More Red Cross officials observed from the corners, making notes. Remove your outer garments, the interpreter instructed. You will be checked for injuries and illness, then deloused and provided with clean clothing. The process began. One by one, prisoners stepped forward to have their names recorded, their physical condition assessed. American medics worked with swift efficiency, checking temperatures, examining wounds, listening to lungs. When they found something concerning, they made notes and set those men aside for further treatment. Yamamoto watched a medic examine Sato's arm, where an old shrapnel wound had never healed properly. The medic frowned, probed gently, then called over a doctor. The doctor spoke in English to the interpreter, who translated, "This wound is infected. It needs to be cleaned and properly dressed. He should have antibiotics." Sato stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as the doctor began cleaning the wound. The pain must have been intense, but Sato made no sound. When the doctor finished wrapping fresh gauze around his arm, he patted Sato's shoulder and said something in English. The interpreter translated, "Rest it. Keep it clean. You'll be fine." Sato looked at the bandage, then at the doctor, confusion flickering across his face. The delousing came next. The prisoners were directed into a shower room where their uniforms were taken away to be burned. They stood naked under hot water that felt like heaven after weeks of grime and salt. Some men closed their eyes and simply stood there, letting the heat soak into their bones. Others scrubbed frantically, trying to wash away more than just dirt. When they emerged, they were given plain work uniforms marked with PW in large letters on the back. The fabric was thick, serviceable, warmer than anything they had worn in months. They were also given wool socks, sturdy boots, and heavy coats. Yamamoto pulled on the socks slowly, almost reverently. His feet had been wrapped in rotting canvas for so long that he had forgotten what dry socks felt like. Fully dressed in their new uniforms, the prisoners were assembled again. The interpreter addressed them once more. "You will now be taken to your barracks. You will have time to rest. At 1800 hours, you will go to the mess hall for your evening meal. Tomorrow, your work assignments will begin. Do you have any questions?" No one spoke. Questions felt dangerous. Questions revealed weakness. They were marched to a barracks at the edge of the compound. Inside, the building was heated by 2 pot-bellied stoves that glowed with warmth. Bunk beds lined both walls, each with a mattress and 2 wool blankets. It was sparse, certainly, but compared to the sleeping conditions on Saipan or Guadalcanal, it looked luxurious. Yamamoto chose a lower bunk near the stove. He sat on the edge of the mattress, testing it. It gave under his weight, soft and yielding. He pressed his hand into it, feeling the springs beneath the thin padding. A real bed, not a hole in the ground, not a pile of palm fronds, but an actual bed. Around him, other prisoners were settling in, claiming bunks, spreading their blankets. The lieutenant, Ishida, stood near the center of the room and cleared his throat. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "We must remain alert. This comfort is designed to weaken us. The Americans want us to forget who we are, to forget our duty to the Emperor. We must not let that happen. We will maintain discipline. We will remember that we are Japanese soldiers, even in captivity." Some men nodded firmly. Others looked uncertain. And a few, like Corporal Sato, simply lay down on their bunks and closed their eyes, too exhausted to care about speeches. Yamamoto sat on his bunk and stared at his hands. They were cleaner than they had been in months, the dirt scrubbed away in the shower, but they still trembled slightly. He wondered what his family was doing at that moment. His mother and younger sister in Osaka. Did they know he was alive? Did they think he had died honorably in battle? The thought of them receiving a letter saying he was a prisoner made his stomach twist with shame. A guard opened the door and shouted something in English. The interpreter stepped in and translated, "Dinner time. Form a line and proceed to the mess hall." The prisoners filed out into the cold evening air. The sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink. They walked in formation, guards flanking them, toward a large building at the center of the camp. As they approached, a smell reached them on the wind. Rich, heavy, fatty. The smell of cooking meat. Several prisoners slowed involuntarily, their noses lifting. When was the last time any of them had smelled meat? Months? Longer? On the islands, they had subsisted on rice balls, dried fish, and whatever they could scavenge. Toward the end, many had eaten nothing but grass and insects. The mess hall was a long building with rows of tables and benches. American soldiers sat eating at some of the tables, talking and laughing. The prisoners were directed to a separate section, but the proximity was jarring. Enemy soldiers eating mere meters away, unafraid, unconcerned. They lined up at a serving counter. Behind it stood American cooks in white aprons, working over grills and steam tables. One of them looked up as the first prisoners approached and said something that made the other cooks laugh. Not cruel laughter, just casual amusement at something mundane. Yamamoto held his tin tray with both hands as he shuffled forward in line. His heart was pounding. Part of him expected that, when he reached the front, the food would be snatched away, or he would be given rotten scraps, or worse. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The man in front of him reached the counter. A cook dropped something onto his tray with a metallic clang. The man stared down at it, frozen. Then Yamamoto stepped forward. The cook, a heavy-set man with rolled-up sleeves and sweat on his forehead, lifted a spatula. He scooped up a brown patty from the grill and placed it on a bun, then added the top half of the bun. He dropped this onto Yamamoto's tray. Next came a scoop of golden fried potatoes, crispy and glistening with oil. Finally, the cook reached into a tub of ice and pulled out a glass bottle. The liquid inside was dark brown, almost black. He popped the cap with a bottle opener and set it on the tray. Yamamoto stared at the tray in his hands. The bun was soft, still warm. The meat patty was thick, juices seeping into the bread. The fried potatoes were piled high, and the bottle had a red label with white script that he couldn't read. "Move along," the cook said in English, gesturing. Yamamoto walked in a daze to a table and sat down. Around him, other prisoners were sitting with similar trays, all wearing expressions of disbelief. Some picked up the burgers with trembling hands. Others stared at the bottles, uncertain what to do with them. Corporal Sato sat across from Yamamoto. He lifted the bottle and sniffed it cautiously. Then he took a sip. His eyes widened. He coughed, sputtered, then took another sip. "It's sweet," he said hoarsely. "Sweet and it burns. What is this?" "Coca-Cola," said a prisoner who had picked up some English from listening to guards. "It's called Coca-Cola." Yamamoto lifted his own bottle and drank. The sweetness hit first, overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity. Then came the carbonation, bubbles fizzing against his tongue and throat, making him cough. It was unlike anything he had ever tasted. In Japan, sugar had been rationed for years. Sweet things had become rare luxuries. And this drink seemed to be nothing but sweetness and bubbles and something else he couldn't identify. He set the bottle down and picked up the hamburger. It felt heavy in his hands, substantial. He raised it to his mouth and bit down. Grease exploded across his tongue. The taste of cooked beef, seasoned and grilled, filled his mouth. It was rich, almost overwhelming. He chewed slowly, and tears sprang to his eyes before he could stop them. Around him, similar reactions rippled through the prisoners. One man laughed, a sharp bark of sound that he quickly stifled with his hand. Another bent forward, shoulders shaking, trying to hide that he was crying. A third ate mechanically, bite after bite, his face blank, but his hands trembling. Yamamoto swallowed and took another bite. The sensation was almost too much. His stomach, used to watery rice and scraps, cramped with the richness. But he couldn't stop. He ate the entire hamburger, then the fried potatoes, then drank the rest of the Coca-Cola, even though his stomach felt painfully full. When he set down his tray, he realized his face was wet with tears. He wiped them away quickly, ashamed. But when he looked around, he saw that he wasn't alone. Many of the men had tears on their faces. Some hid it better than others, but the emotion was there, raw and undeniable. Lieutenant Ishida sat at the end of a table, his hamburger untouched in front of him. He stared at it with an expression of profound conflict. Finally, he picked it up and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his jaw working, his eyes distant. When he swallowed, he set the burger down and covered his face with his hands. Corporal Sato leaned across the table toward Yamamoto. "I had forgotten," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I had forgotten what fat tastes like, what meat tastes like. How could I have forgotten?" Yamamoto had no answer. His own memories of food in Japan seemed distant and faded. Rice and fish and pickled vegetables. Simple meals that had once seemed normal but now felt like feasts compared to the starvation rations of the war. And this American meal, this hamburger and Coca-Cola, was something else entirely. It wasn't just food. It was abundance made tangible. The mess hall was quiet except for the sounds of eating and the occasional muffled sob. Even the American soldiers at the other tables seemed to sense something and kept their voices low. The cooks behind the counter worked in silence, occasionally glancing at the prisoners but saying nothing. When the meal ended, guards directed the prisoners to return their trays and head back to the barracks. They walked through the cold night air, their stomachs full for the first time in longer than most could remember. The sensation was disorienting. Some men walked slowly, as if the weight in their bellies made movement difficult. Others walked quickly, as though trying to escape the confusion of what had just happened. Back in the barracks, the prisoners climbed into their bunks. The stoves still glowed with warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, wrapped in wool blankets with full stomachs, the men lay in silence. Yamamoto stared at the wooden slats of the bunk above him. His mind churned with thoughts he couldn't organize. He had expected torture. He had expected starvation. He had expected to be treated as less than human because that was what the propaganda had promised. Instead, he had been given a hot shower, clean clothes, a warm bed, and a meal that was better than anything he had eaten as a free soldier. From the bunk above him came a whisper. "Yamamoto, are you awake?" "Yes." "What are they doing to us?" Yamamoto had no answer. He didn't understand it either. How could the enemy be so cruel as to treat them well? It would have been easier to endure beatings and starvation. That, at least, he had been prepared for. But kindness, abundance, these things had no place in his understanding of war. "I don't know," he finally whispered back. "I don't know." Across the barracks, Lieutenant Ishida sat on his bunk, his back against the wall. He had not lain down. In his hands, he held a small photograph that he kept hidden in the lining of his boot. His wife and 2 young sons, smiling at the camera on a spring day before the war. He wondered what they were eating tonight. Rice, if they were lucky. More likely, sweet potato greens or millet gruel. And here he sat, in enemy captivity, with a stomach full of beef and fried potatoes. The shame of it was almost unbearable. But deeper than the shame was a more troubling thought, one he tried to push away, but couldn't. If the Americans could feed their prisoners hamburgers and Coca-Cola as routine rations, what did that say about American strength? What did it say about Japanese chances of victory? He folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into his boot. Then he lay down and pulled the blanket over himself, closing his eyes against thoughts he didn't want to face. Morning came with the sound of a bugle. The prisoners woke stiffly, unused to having slept on mattresses. For a moment, some of them forgot where they were. Then memory returned, and with it, the complex tangle of emotions from the night before. They formed up for roll call in the yard. The American sergeant who conducted it was brisk and efficient, checking names off a list with mechanical precision. Then the interpreter stepped forward. "Today, you will begin orientation. You will learn the camp rules, the work you will be assigned, and your rights under the Geneva Convention. But first, breakfast." The mention of food sent a ripple through the prisoners. Their stomachs, which had spent so long empty, now anticipated being filled. It was a strange sensation, this expectation of regular meals. The march to the mess hall repeated the pattern from the night before. The same smells greeted them, though different this time. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Yamamoto had drunk coffee once before the war, a bitter black liquid served in a cafe in Tokyo. But the coffee here came with cream and sugar, transforming it into something almost sweet. The breakfast tray held scrambled eggs, strips of bacon crispy and glistening with fat, buttered toast, and a mug of that sweetened coffee. Once again, the prisoners sat in silence, eating with expressions caught between pleasure and pain. This time, Lieutenant Ishida did not hesitate. He ate quickly, mechanically, as though trying to complete an unpleasant duty. When he finished, he stood and addressed the men. "Listen carefully. The Americans are trying to weaken us with comfort. They feed us well so that we forget our hunger. They house us warmly so that we forget hardship. They treat us with procedures so that we forget they are our enemy. Do not be fooled. This is a strategy. We must remain vigilant. We must remember who we are." Several prisoners nodded, wanting to believe that the lieutenant's words made sense of the confusion they felt. But others looked down at their empty plates, unconvinced. Because the truth was that comfort did weaken them. Full stomachs made it harder to maintain hatred. Warm beds made it harder to sustain fighting spirit. And that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. After breakfast, the prisoners were assembled in a large room for orientation. A Red Cross official stood at the front with the interpreter beside him. He held up a pamphlet. "This," the interpreter translated, "contains the text of the Geneva Convention, which governs the treatment of prisoners of war. I will explain your rights." For the next hour, the prisoners listened as the interpreter outlined rules that seemed impossible. They would be allowed to write letters home, 2 per month. They would be allowed to receive packages from family. They would work, but only in certain types of labor, and they would be paid. They would have access to medical care. They would not be subjected to torture or degrading treatment. They would be visited regularly by neutral inspectors to ensure compliance with these rules. It was too much to take in. Every statement contradicted what they had been taught. One prisoner finally raised his hand, tentatively. "Yes?" the interpreter said. "Why?" the prisoner asked. "Why do you follow these rules? We are your enemies. Why would you treat us well?" The interpreter translated the question for the Red Cross official, who nodded and responded. The interpreter translated back, "Because the Geneva Convention is an agreement between civilized nations that even in war, there are limits to what we do to each other. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings. These rules exist to preserve that humanity." The prisoner sat back down, his face troubled. The concept of limiting war, of maintaining humanity in the midst of killing, was foreign to him. In the Japanese military, war was absolute. The enemy was to be destroyed utterly. Mercy was weakness. But here were the Americans, claiming that even enemies deserved certain treatment. The rest of the orientation covered practical matters: where to go for medical issues, how to request items from the canteen, work schedules and expectations, rules about behavior and consequences for breaking them. It was all very bureaucratic, very organized, very American. When it ended, the prisoners were given the rest of the day to settle in. Some wrote letters home, carefully choosing words that wouldn't reveal their shame. Others simply sat on their bunks, lost in thought. A few gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about what they had experienced. Yamamoto found himself outside, standing near the barbed wire fence, looking out at the Wisconsin landscape. Snow covered everything in soft white. Bare trees stood like dark sentinels against the pale sky. It was beautiful in a stark, cold way. Nothing like the tropical hell of the Pacific Islands. A guard walked by, patrolling the perimeter. As he passed Yamamoto, he nodded. Just a brief acknowledgement. Yamamoto blinked, startled. The guard had nodded to him, not with contempt or mockery, but with simple recognition, as though Yamamoto were a person, not just a prisoner number. It was such a small gesture, but it hit Yamamoto with unexpected force. For months he had been treated as expendable. His own officers had sent him into suicidal charges. His own government had told him death was preferable to surrender. And now, in captivity, an enemy guard nodded to him in passing. He turned away from the fence, his throat tight with emotion he didn't understand. That evening, dinner was served. This time it was chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and again, Coca-Cola. The pattern was establishing itself. 3 meals a day, real food, regular schedules. It was all so normal, so routine, that it created a kind of cognitive dissonance. How could captivity feel so stable? How could the enemy seem so organized? Over the following days, the prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life. They were assigned work details. Some were sent to cut firewood in the surrounding forests. Others worked on road maintenance. A few with specific skills were assigned to repair work or laundry duty. The work was steady but not backbreaking, and at the end of each day, they received small coupons that could be exchanged at the camp canteen. The canteen was a revelation. A small building where prisoners could buy extras with their work coupons, cigarettes, chocolate bars, writing paper, toiletries. The sight of these things, available for purchase, was almost surreal. In Japan, such items had been unavailable or rationed to near nothing for years. But here, behind barbed wire, they were simply there on shelves. Yamamoto stood in the canteen one afternoon, holding a chocolate bar he had just purchased. It was wrapped in brown paper with English writing. He turned it over in his hands, marveling at it. Chocolate. He had tasted it once as a child, a gift from a wealthy uncle, and now he held one here in a prison camp, bought with wages earned from captive labor. He unwrapped it slowly and took a bite. The sweetness flooded his mouth, rich and smooth. He closed his eyes, trying not to think about his sister back in Osaka, who probably hadn't tasted sugar in years. The contradictions mounted with each passing day. The Americans were the enemy, but they provided medical care when prisoners fell ill. The Americans were supposed to be barbaric, but they followed strict rules about treatment. The Americans were losing the war, or so the propaganda said, yet they had food and supplies in such abundance that they could waste it on prisoners. One evening, Corporal Sato sat on his bunk and spoke quietly to Yamamoto. My wife writes that she trades kimono fabric for rice on the black market. She says my children eat once a day if they are lucky. Meanwhile, I eat 3 times a day, every day, and the food is better than what I ate as a soldier. I know, Yamamoto said. How can this be right? How can I live better as a prisoner than my family lives as free people? I don't know. Sato lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The lieutenant says we must resist, that we must not let comfort make us weak. But Yamamoto, I am so tired of being strong. I am so tired of fighting. Sometimes I think, maybe it's all right to just be weak for a while. Yamamoto didn't respond, because he felt the same way, and admitting it felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught. In the barracks that night, after lights out, the darkness filled with whispered conversations. Men talking about home, about families, about the war. Some argued that Japan would still win, that this was just a temporary setback. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, they had been lied to about everything. And in the morning, the bugle would sound again, and they would wake to another day of routine. Another day of being fed and housed and treated according to rules they still couldn't fully believe were real. But the food was real. The warm beds were real. And slowly, inevitably, those realities were changing something fundamental in the men of Camp McCoy. The real breaking point was yet to come, because food and shelter were one thing. But human connection, genuine kindness from the enemy, would prove even harder to reconcile with everything they had been taught about who the Americans were. End of Part 1. Japanese POWs broke down after tasting hamburgers and Coca-Cola in U.S. camps. Part 2. The transformation, captivity. First snow of December fell heavy and thick, turning Camp McCoy into a landscape that reminded some prisoners of northern Japan. By now, they had been in the camp for over a month. The shock of arrival had faded, replaced by something more complicated. Routine laced with constant psychological conflict. Yamamoto woke each morning to the bugle call, pulled on his work clothes, and marched to breakfast with the others. Oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, sometimes pancakes with maple syrup, a sweetness so intense it made his teeth ache. Coffee with cream, always the coffee. He had grown to crave it, that warm, bitter-sweet liquid that the Americans drank constantly as though it were water. After breakfast came work. His detail had been assigned to the camp wood shop, where they built crates and repaired furniture under the supervision of an American sergeant named Miller. Miller was young, maybe 22, with red hair and freckles across his nose. He spoke no Japanese, but he had learned to communicate through gestures and drawings and a kind of patient repetition that transcended language. One morning, Miller was teaching them how to properly use a hand plane to smooth rough lumber. He demonstrated the motion, the tool gliding across the wood surface, producing thin curls of shavings that fell like ribbons. Then he handed the plane to Yamamoto. "You try," Miller said, gesturing. Yamamoto took the tool carefully. He had worked with wood before in his father's carpentry shop in Osaka. The familiar weight of the plane in his hands brought a sudden sharp memory of his father's workshop, the smell of sawdust, the sound of his father humming while he worked. He positioned the plane and pushed it smoothly across the board. Perfect curls of wood peeled away. Miller's face broke into a wide grin. "Good, very good." He gave Yamamoto a thumbs up. Something warm flickered in Yamamoto's chest. Pride. He had pleased his captor with his skill, and instead of feeling shame, he felt satisfaction. The realization troubled him, but not enough to erase the feeling. Language became a bridge and a barrier. Some prisoners refused to learn any English on principle. Lieutenant Ishida was among them. He insisted that learning the enemy's language was a form of surrender, a weakening of Japanese identity. "We must maintain our culture," he said firmly. "Our language is our soul." But others, driven by curiosity or practical necessity, began to pick up words and phrases. The guards helped, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. A guard pointing to his boot and saying "boot" clearly and slowly. A prisoner repeating "boot" with an accent that made the guard smile and nod encouragingly. In the evenings, after dinner, some prisoners gathered in a corner of the barracks for what they called English time. One of them, a former teacher named Tanaka, led the sessions. He would write words on a piece of paper, and they would practice pronunciation together. Simple words at first: bread, water, cold, hot, yes, no, thank you. Yamamoto attended these sessions, sitting in the back, listening more than participating. He told himself it was just practical. If he could understand commands, he would avoid punishment. But the truth was that language opened small windows into the American world, and he was curious in ways he couldn't fully admit. One evening, Sergeant Miller came to the barracks during English time. He stood in the doorway, watching the prisoners practice. Then he stepped inside and walked over to where they sat. "Mind if I join?" he asked. The interpreter, who was present, translated. Tanaka hesitated, then gestured to an empty spot. Miller sat down cross-legged with the prisoners. He pulled out a small photograph from his wallet. "Family," he said, pointing to the picture. The prisoners leaned in to look. A woman with dark hair and a kind smile. Two little girls in matching dresses. A house with a porch in the background. "Mother," Miller said, pointing to the woman. "Sisters," pointing to the girls. "Home," pointing to the house. Then he looked expectantly at the prisoners. After a moment, Corporal Sato reached into his jacket and pulled out his own worn photograph. His wife, standing in a garden, holding their baby son. Miller took the photo carefully, studied it, and nodded. "Beautiful," he said. "Family beautiful." Sato's eyes grew wet. He nodded, unable to speak. For the next hour, Miller sat with them, teaching them English words and learning Japanese ones in return. He taught them apple and tree and snow. They taught him sakura for cherry blossom and umi for ocean. The communication was broken and halting, but something passed between them in that dim barracks that transcended words. A recognition of shared humanity. Men separated by war, but connected by the simple fact that they all had mothers, sisters, homes they missed. When Miller finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Good night," he said. Then, in careful broken Japanese, "Oyasumi." The prisoners stared. One of them had taught him that phrase earlier, and Miller had remembered. He had cared enough to try. After he left, Lieutenant Ishida, who had been watching from his bunk in the corner, spoke coldly. fraternization with the enemy, sharing photographs, learning each other's languages. Do you understand what you are doing? You are becoming soft. You are forgetting why we fight. Tanaka looked up at the lieutenant. Respectfully, sir, we are not fighting anymore. We are prisoners. And that guard has shown us more kindness than our own officers did when they ordered us into suicide charges. The barracks went very quiet. For a Japanese soldier to criticize officers so directly was nearly unthinkable. But no one contradicted Tanaka, because everyone in that room knew he spoke the truth. Winter deepened. The work continued. The meals continued. And slowly, gradually, relationships formed that shouldn't have existed between enemies. There was the guard who shared his cigarettes with the work crews, lighting them himself and passing them around. There was the medic who sat with prisoners in the infirmary, not just treating their ailments, but asking about their lives before the war. There was the cook who sometimes added extra portions to the prisoners' trays when the officers weren't watching. And there was the canteen. The camp canteen had become a strange focal point of cultural exchange. With their work coupons, prisoners could buy small luxuries. But what fascinated them most was watching the American soldiers make their own purchases, the casualness of it, the abundance. One afternoon, Yamamoto stood in line at the canteen behind an American soldier. The soldier bought a Coca-Cola, a candy bar, and a pack of chewing gum without even counting his money. He just tossed some coins on the counter and walked away. The transaction took maybe 30 seconds. When Yamamoto stepped up, he carefully counted out his coupons to buy a single chocolate bar. The purchase represented a week's worth of work wages. He handled the chocolate bar like it was made of gold, the American clerk noticed. "You really like those, huh?" Yamamoto didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Friendly, conversational. He nodded. The clerk smiled and added a second chocolate bar to the transaction. "On the house," he said. Yamamoto blinked. He started to protest, to offer more coupons, but the clerk waved him off. A gift. The American was giving him a gift. He walked back to his barracks holding both chocolate bars, his mind spinning. Such a small thing. But to him, in that moment, it felt enormous. How could he reconcile the image of the barbaric enemy with a clerk who gave away free chocolate? That night, he gave one bar to Corporal Sato, whose wife had written that their son was sick and there was no medicine. Sato took the chocolate, unwrapped it slowly, and ate half. He saved the other half, wrapping it carefully in paper. "For my son," he said. "When I go home, I will take this to him, and I will tell him that even in the darkest places, small kindnesses exist." But the kindnesses made the contradictions harder to bear. Letters from home arrived sporadically, and each one carried news of worsening conditions in Japan. Food shortages growing severe, air raids increasing, cities burning, family members sick, injured, dying. Yamamoto received a letter from his mother in January. Her handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and cheap. She wrote that his sister had taken a job in a munitions factory to help support them. She wrote that they ate sweet potato leaves and radish greens and, on good days, a small portion of rice mixed with barley. She wrote that she was proud of him, that she prayed for his honorable service to the emperor. He read the letter 3 times, then sat on his bunk with his head in his hands. That evening, at dinner, he could barely eat. The roast beef on his plate tasted like ashes. How could he swallow this food knowing his mother was starving? How could he sleep on a warm mattress knowing his sister was working herself to exhaustion in a factory? Corporal Sato found him outside after dinner, standing in the snow. "You received a letter?" "Yes. Bad news?" "My family is hungry, and I am fat." The word hung between them. Fat. It was true. After months of regular meals, the prisoners had gained weight. Their cheeks had filled out. Their ribs no longer showed through their shirts. They looked healthy, well-fed, alive, while their families starved. "I think about this every day," Sato admitted quietly. "I think about my wife trading our last possessions for a handful of rice, and I eat 3 meals a day. I have become soft, weak, comfortable. Is comfort weakness? Yamamoto asked. Or is comfort just comfort? Neither of them had an answer. The psychological strain of this contradiction manifested in different ways among the prisoners. Some clung desperately to the idea that Japan would still win the war, that their captivity was temporary, that soon they would be liberated and return as heroes. Others grew cynical, accepting that the war was lost and they were merely surviving, and a few began to question everything they had been taught. Arguments erupted in the barracks, especially late at night when the lights were out, and men spoke more freely in the darkness. "We were lied to," one prisoner whispered fiercely one night. "We were told America was weak, that they were running out of supplies, that they couldn't sustain the war. But look around. They feed us better than our own army fed us. They have so much that they can waste it on prisoners. We were lied to about everything." "Quiet," another prisoner hissed. "Such talk is treasonous." "Treason to who?" "We are defeated men. What more can they take from us?" "Our honor." "They can take our honor." "Honor?" The first prisoner laughed bitterly. "I lost my honor the moment I surrendered." "We all did. Everything since has just been surviving." Lieutenant Ishida's voice cut through the darkness. "Enough. We maintain discipline. We maintain faith. Japan will prevail because the spirit of the Japanese people is unbreakable. Material advantages mean nothing against our will." But even the lieutenant's voice lacked its former certainty. As winter gave way to early spring, news from the war began to filter into the camp through guards' conversations. Newspapers glimpsed in passing, and whispers from the interpreters. The news was bad. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island after island falling. B-29 bombers were reaching Japanese cities. The home islands were under direct attack. The prisoners absorbed this information in silence. Some refused to believe it. Others grew quietly desperate. What would be left of Japan by the war's end? Would there even be homes to return to? In March, a new development came that changed the atmosphere of the camp. The military began showing films to the prisoners as part of what they called re-education. The films were propaganda, certainly, but they also showed something undeniable: American industrial capacity. The prisoners sat in a makeshift theater, really just a large room with a projector and rows of chairs, and watched footage of American factories. Endless assembly lines producing tanks, aircraft, ships. Workers, many of them women, riveting and welding and building the machinery of war at a pace that seemed impossible. One film showed the launch of a Liberty ship, a massive cargo vessel built from start to finish in just weeks. The narrator explained in English, the interpreter translating, "American shipyards are producing cargo vessels faster than German submarines can sink them. The production capacity of American industry is unmatched in human history." The prisoners watched in stunned silence. They had been told that America was decadent, that the American people lacked the discipline and will to wage total war. But the images on the screen showed something else entirely: organized efficiency, industrial power on a scale Japan couldn't match. Women working in factories while men fought overseas, keeping the economy running at full capacity. After the film ended, Yamamoto sat in his chair while others filed out. The scope of what he had seen was overwhelming. Japan had mobilized its entire population, sacrificed everything, pushed itself to the breaking point. And America? America had done all of that while still maintaining abundance, while still feeding prisoners hamburgers and Coca-Cola. That night, lying in his bunk, Yamamoto faced a thought he had been avoiding for months. Japan had lost this war from the beginning, not because of lack of courage or fighting spirit, but because of simple arithmetic. You cannot defeat an enemy that can produce 10 times as much as you, while simultaneously feeding its prisoners better than you feed your own soldiers. The realization was devastating. Everything he had believed, everything he had been taught, everything he had fought for, all of it built on a foundation of comfortable lies. April brought warmer weather, and with it, an expansion of work details outside the camp. Prisoners were transported under guard to nearby farms to help with planting. The farmers, mostly older men whose sons were away fighting, needed the labor. They eyed the Japanese prisoners with suspicion at first, but necessity overcame prejudice. Yamamoto's work crew was assigned to a farm owned by a man named Henderson. He was in his 60s, tall and weathered, with hands gnarled from decades of farm work. He spoke little, just pointed at tasks and expected them to be done. But on the third day, Henderson brought out a water jug and tin cups during the midday break. He poured water for the prisoners, then sat on the porch of his barn and watched them drink. Finally he spoke. "My sons in the Pacific, fighting your people," the interpreter translated. The prisoners froze, uncertain how to respond. Henderson continued, "I thought I'd hate you, thought I'd want to work you into the ground. But you're just men, tired men, far from home, same as him." He paused, looking out over his fields. "War's a funny thing. Makes enemies of people who'd probably get along fine if they met different circumstances." One of the prisoners, emboldened by Henderson's tone, spoke up. The interpreter translated, "We hope your son comes home safe." Henderson looked at the prisoner for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I hope the same for yours." It was a small exchange, but it rippled through the work crew. They worked harder that afternoon, not because they were forced to, but because Henderson had treated them like humans. He had acknowledged their humanity and his own son's safety in the same breath. It was the kind of moment that the propaganda had never prepared them for. By May, the camp had settled into routines so normal they almost felt permanent. But everyone knew the war was reaching its climax. The guards grew tense. The interpreters brought grimmer news. And then came rumors that shook even those prisoners who had clung to hope. Soviet forces were mobilizing against Japan. Germany had surrendered. Japan stood alone. On August 6th, strange news filtered through the camp. Something had happened to Hiroshima. A single bomb. A city destroyed. The details were confused, contradictory, impossible to believe. The prisoners gathered in small groups, arguing in hushed voices about whether it could be true. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb. Another city gone. And then, on August 15th, the announcement that broke everything. Emperor Hirohito's voice on the radio, speaking to the nation for the first time in history. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the news officially. The interpreter's voice shook as he translated the emperor's words. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Enduring the unendurable. Suffering the insufferable." Some prisoners wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few stood and walked out, unable to bear being around others in their shame. The war was over, and they had lived, and Japan had lost. Everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, had ended in defeat. Lieutenant Ishida stood at the front of the room, his face gray. He tried to speak, to rally the men, to say something about honor or dignity, but no words came. He simply stood there, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, until finally he sat down and put his face in his hands. That night, the barracks was filled with the sounds of men crying. Some quietly, some without restraint. They mourned for their country, for their families, for the years lost, for the comrades who had died in vain. They mourned for the fact that they had survived when survival itself felt like betrayal. Yamamoto lay in his bunk, dry-eyed, feeling hollow. He thought about his father, who had sent him off to war with pride. He thought about his mother and sister, struggling to survive in a defeated nation. He thought about Sergeant Miller, who had sat with them and shared photographs of his family. He thought about the farmer Henderson, who hoped his son would come home safe, and he thought about hamburgers and Coca-Cola. The taste that had broken something in him that first night. The taste that had shown him that the enemy was not what he had been told. The taste of a contradiction he would carry for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed were strange. The war was over, but the prisoners remained in Camp McCoy while the military worked out repatriation logistics. The guards were more relaxed now, less vigilant. Some even seemed sympathetic. The routine continued: meals, work, sleep. But the purpose had changed. They were no longer prisoners of an active war. They were simply men waiting to go home. The Red Cross intensified their visits, ensuring preparations were made for the long journey back across the Pacific. Medical examinations confirmed the prisoners were healthy enough to travel. Ironic, considering most of them were in better physical condition than when they had arrived. In September, the orders came. They would be leaving within the week. The prisoners gathered their few belongings: the letters from home, the photographs, the small items they had acquired. Some kept the wooden carvings they had made during idle hours. Others threw everything away, wanting no reminders of this place. On the day of departure, the prisoners lined up in the yard one final time. The guards stood at attention. Sergeant Miller was there, watching as the men he had worked with for months prepared to leave. Yamamoto caught his eye. Miller nodded once, a gesture of respect. Yamamoto bowed slightly in return. As they marched toward the trucks that would take them to the train station, Yamamoto glanced back at Camp McCoy. The barracks, the mess hall, the guard towers, the barbed wire that had kept them contained. This place where he had expected death and found something much more complicated. The journey home was long, first by train across America, then by ship across the Pacific. The prisoners huddled together, sharing space with other repatriated POWs from other camps. They swapped stories, comparing experiences. Some camps had been harsher, some more lenient, but the pattern was consistent. Americans followed rules. They fed prisoners. They provided medical care. They treated men according to a code that seemed almost incomprehensible to soldiers raised in the Imperial Japanese Army. As the ship approached Japan, the prisoners lined the rails, straining to see their homeland. What they saw made their hearts sink. Yokohama Harbor was devastated. Burned buildings, twisted metal, rubble. The ship docked in a port that looked like it had been bombed back to the Stone Age. When they stepped onto Japanese soil, reality hit like a physical blow. This wasn't the Japan they had left. This was a defeated nation, broken and occupied. American soldiers were everywhere, not as enemies now, but as occupiers. The prisoners, the survivors, walked through streets that barely existed, past civilians who looked at them with expressions mixing relief and resentment. Yamamoto made his way to Osaka, to the neighborhood where his family had lived. What he found was rubble and makeshift shelters. His mother and sister had survived, living in a small room in a building that was half collapsed. When his mother saw him, she collapsed into sobs, grabbing him, feeling his arms and face to confirm he was real. "You're alive," she kept saying. "You're alive." But there was something else in her eyes. A question she didn't ask, but he could see. "How are you so healthy when we are so thin?" His sister brought out their evening meal, a small bowl of thin soup with a few pieces of sweet potato. She divided it carefully into 3 portions, giving Yamamoto the largest. He stared at the bowl, thinking of the meals he had eaten 3 times a day for months. Hamburgers, fried chicken, roast beef, Coca-Cola. He took a sip of the soup. It was barely more than hot water with a hint of flavor. His family ate this once a day. This was all they had. That night, lying on a thin mat on the floor of their damaged room, Yamamoto tried to sleep, but couldn't. The guilt was crushing. He had lived while so many had died. He had eaten while his family starved. He had been treated kindly by the enemy while his nation burned. But deeper than the guilt was a confusion that would never fully resolve. Because the Americans had shown him something he couldn't forget, that even enemies could show mercy, that even in war, humanity could persist, that abundance existed in the world, even if Japan had never possessed it. In the years that followed, few of the former prisoners spoke openly about their experiences in American camps. The shame of surrender was too great. Japanese society wasn't ready to hear that captivity had been anything other than hellish. So the men buried their stories, carrying them in silence. But sometimes, in private moments, they would tell their children. They would describe the cold Wisconsin winter, the warm barracks, the meals that seemed impossible. And they would speak, quietly and with confusion still evident in their voices, about how kindness had been harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Corporal Sato, who survived the war and returned to his fishing village, told his son many years later, "I learned in America that the enemy was not what I had been taught. They were not monsters. They were just men, with families and homes and beliefs of their own. They fought us, yes, but when we were defeated, they fed us. And that simple act of feeding changed everything I thought I knew about war and humanity." Yamamoto eventually reopened his father's carpentry shop in Osaka. He married, had children, rebuilt his life in a nation rebuilding itself. But he never drank Coca-Cola again. The taste reminded him too much of that first night in Camp McCoy, when everything he believed had begun to crumble. Years later, his daughter found him in his workshop one evening, staring at an old photograph. It showed a group of men in prison uniforms standing outside a barracks in the snow. She asked who they were. "Prisoners," he said. "In America, during the war." "Was it terrible?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "No," he finally said. "That was what made it terrible. It wasn't terrible, and that was the hardest thing to understand." The legacy of Camp McCoy and other American POW camps is not found in grand historical narratives or strategic analyses. It's found in these small stories, these private confessions, these moments of confusion that lingered for decades. It's found in the fact that the Japanese prisoners had expected devils and found men, that they had prepared for cruelty and received procedure, that they had braced for starvation and were given hamburgers. The contradiction broke something in them, not violently, not dramatically, but slowly and irreversibly. Because violence they could have endured. Violence would have confirmed everything they had been taught. But kindness, systematic, rule-bound, almost casual kindness, that they had no framework for understanding. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, a group of former prisoners organized a trip back to America. They wanted to see Camp McCoy again, to show their children and grandchildren where they had spent those confusing months. The camp had been converted to other uses, but the basic structures remained. Yamamoto was among them. He was 65 years old, his hair gray, his hands still skilled with woodworking tools. He stood in the place where the mess hall had been and closed his eyes, remembering the smell of grilled meat, the sound of trays clattering, the taste of Coca-Cola fizzing on his tongue. His grandson, a teenager who had grown up in peaceful, prosperous modern Japan, asked him what he was remembering. "Hamburgers," Yamamoto said. "And how much they confused me." The boy laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Yamamoto wasn't joking, because those hamburgers, that Coca-Cola, that simple meal on that first cold night, had taught him a lesson that took decades to fully understand. Humanity persists even in war. Mercy can exist even between enemies. And sometimes the hardest thing to survive is not cruelty, but kindness that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world. The taste of that meal stayed with him for the rest of his life. Not because it was delicious, though it was, but because it was the taste of contradiction, of complexity, of a truth he hadn't been prepared to face, that the enemy was human, just like him. And perhaps that is the real story of Camp McCoy and the Japanese prisoners who passed through its gates. Not a story of suffering, but of confusion. Not a story of cruelty, but of unexpected mercy. Not a story of enemies, but of men who slowly, reluctantly, painfully came to recognize each other's humanity. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The camps closed. But the memories remained, complicated and unresolved, carrying a message that transcends the specific conflict. In the darkest hours of human history, when nations mobilize to destroy each other, small acts of humanity still matter. A hamburger shared, a guard nodding in recognition, a farmer offering water, a clerk giving away free chocolate. These moments don't erase the horror of war, but they remind us that even in war, we have choices about how we treat each other. And sometimes, those choices, those small mercies, leave deeper marks than all the battles combined. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more true accounts from World War II. These stories, buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours, choices that reveal who we really are.